In 1949, the world stood at the edge of annihilating itself. An American spy plane circling the vast emptiness of Siberia detected something impossible: radioactive particles drifting on the wind. The Soviets had just detonated an atomic bomb, 4 years ahead of every Western intelligence estimate. 4 years that would reshape the balance of terror for generations. President Truman was handed the report in disbelief. His advisors scrambled for explanations. How could Stalin's backward, war-ravaged Soviet Union, a nation still burying its 20 million dead, possibly build such a weapon so quickly? The answer wasn't in Moscow's laboratories. It was sitting in a quiet office in Harwell, England. A mild-mannered physicist with thick glasses and a gentle smile. A man whose colleagues called him the most harmless person they'd ever met. His name was Klaus Fuchs, and he had just changed the course of human history. To understand how one man could hand Stalin the atomic bomb, you have to go back to Germany in the 1930s, to a young Klaus Fuchs watching his world burn. Born in 1911 to a Lutheran pastor who preached radical politics and social justice, Klaus grew up in a household where moral conviction meant everything. His father's sermons about equality and fighting oppression weren't just Sunday philosophy, they were a call to action. And Klaus answered that call with the fervor of true belief. By his early 20s, he joined the German Communist Party, distributing pamphlets, organizing students, genuinely believing he was building a better world. Then came the Nazis. Hitler's brown shirts weren't arresting communists, they were beating them to death in the streets. In 1933, Klaus Fuchs fled for his life. He watched from exile as the Gestapo arrested his family. His father was thrown into prison. His sister Crystal barely escaped. And his sister Elizabeth, gentle, brilliant Elizabeth, threw herself in front of a train, unable to bear the psychological torture any longer. Think about that. While Klaus was pursuing his doctorate in physics at British universities, the Nazis were systematically destroying everyone he loved. Is it any wonder that when another government asked for his help fighting fascism, he said yes without hesitation? That government was the Soviet Union. Here's where the story gets fascinating and tragic. Klaus Fuchs was exactly the kind of man British intelligence thought they could trust. Soft-spoken, polite. A brilliant theoretical physicist who worked quietly and efficiently. When Britain interned him as an enemy alien at the start of World War II, a cruel irony, imprisoning a refugee from Hitler, his colleagues vouched for him so enthusiastically that he was released and given security clearance. For weapons research, what no one knew was that Soviet intelligence had already identified him. They'd watched him flee Germany, tracked his communist connections, and recognized something more valuable than a committed idealist. They'd found a man drowning in guilt. Fuchs believed his family had suffered because he'd abandoned them, because he'd run while they stayed to fight. The Soviets understood this psychology perfectly. They didn't have to threaten him or bribe him. They simply gave him what he desperately needed. A way to balance the scales, a way to matter again. In 1941, a Soviet agent approached Fuchs with the simplest of propositions. The Soviet Union, fighting the Nazis, bleeding on the Eastern Front, needed help. Would he share information about British weapons research? Klaus Fuchs looked into the mirror and saw a coward who'd let his family die. The Soviets were offering him redemption wrapped in ideology. He said yes. At first, Fuchs was feeding the Soviets information about conventional weapons. Useful, certainly, but not world-changing. Then, in 1942, everything shifted. The British government read him into tube alloys, the innocent-sounding code name for Britain's atomic bomb project. Suddenly, Klaus Fuchs found himself at the theoretical heart of the most devastating weapon ever conceived. And he was copying everything. Every calculation, every design parameter, every breakthrough in uranium enrichment and critical mass theory. He'd work all day solving the physics of nuclear fission, then spend his evenings carefully transcribing those same equations for his Soviet handlers. The tradecraft was almost comically simple. Dead drops in quiet corners of British towns, rolled up documents left in hiding spots. He never used codes or complicated spy techniques. He just walked the information straight out of secure facilities and handed it over. And here's the truly chilling part. He was good at it. His compartmentalized mind, the same quality that made him a brilliant physicist, allowed him to keep his two lives completely separate. To his colleagues, he was Klaus, the helpful German refugee who never caused problems. To Moscow, he was a source so valuable they gave him his own code name, Charles. But the real opportunity was still coming. In December 1943, Klaus Fuchs boarded a ship for New York. The British atomic program was merging with the American Manhattan Project, and Fuchs was part of the British team being sent to help. He was assigned to Los Alamos, New Mexico, a secret city built on a remote mesa where the greatest scientific minds in the world were racing to build the bomb before Hitler did. Fuchs found himself working alongside legends: Oppenheimer, Fermi, Beta, Teller. These weren't just good physicists, they were the architects of atomic age. And Klaus Fuchs was working on the most sensitive calculations of all, the implosion design for the plutonium bomb. Think about the irony. The United States government had assembled the most closely guarded secret in human history, surrounded by fences and security checks and constant surveillance. They'd built an entire hidden city in the desert to keep this information from leaking, and they'd invited the leak inside. Every few weeks, Fuchs would take the train to Santa Fe. Officially, he was getting away from the isolation of Los Alamos, enjoying a rare break. In reality, he was meeting his Soviet contact, a man named Harry Gold, and handing over detailed schematics of America's atomic bomb. The exact dimensions of the plutonium core, the lens configuration for the implosion system, calculations on yield and efficiency. Every breakthrough, every failure, every hard-won secret, Klaus Fuchs copied it all. Moscow didn't just know America was building an atomic bomb. Thanks to Fuchs, they knew exactly how to build one too. July 16, 1945. The New Mexico desert just before dawn. Klaus Fuchs stood with the other scientists at the Trinity test site watching the sky. They'd spent years on pure theory, calculating forces that had never existed outside stars. Now they were about to create a miniature sun on Earth. When the bomb detonated, the flash was so bright it could be seen 200 miles away. The mushroom cloud rose 7 miles into the atmosphere. The desert sand melted into radioactive glass. And Klaus Fuchs knew, standing there with his colleagues watching them cheer and embrace, that he'd just witnessed the birth of a new kind of terror. Some of the scientists wept. Oppenheimer famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." They understood they'd crossed a threshold humanity could never step back from. Fuchs felt no such existential crisis. Within weeks, he'd written a detailed report of Trinity for his Soviet handlers. The yield, the design, the precise results, everything. 3 weeks later, America dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world watched entire cities evaporate in moments. The nuclear age had arrived, and Stalin knew he could build the same weapon, because Klaus Fuchs had already given him the blueprints. After the war, Fuchs returned to Britain as a hero of sorts. He was appointed to a senior position at Harwell, Britain's new atomic research facility. Given higher security clearance, trusted with even more secrets. And he kept spying. For 4 more years, Klaus Fuchs lived a double life so perfect it would seem fictional if it weren't true. By day, he was the respected physicist, solving problems for British nuclear research. By night, he was the Soviet agent, photographing documents and passing them to his handlers. He helped design Britain's first atomic bomb. Then he told the Soviets exactly how it worked. He attended high-level security meetings. Then he reported everything discussed. He built his reputation as one of Britain's most reliable scientists, and he used that reputation to betray everything his adopted country stood for. But here's what makes Klaus Fuchs different from other spies. He wasn't doing it for money. The
The Soviets never paid him a penny. He wasn't being blackmailed. No one knew about his espionage. He was doing it purely out of conviction. He genuinely believed that the Soviet Union deserved the atomic bomb, that America's nuclear monopoly was dangerous, that the balance of power needed to be equalized. In his mind, he wasn't committing treason. He was preventing catastrophe. The terrifying part? He might have gotten away with it forever. The break in the case came from America, not Britain. In 1949, the FBI and Army intelligence cracked Soviet codes. From wartime transmissions, a project called Venona. Buried in the decrypted messages were references to a Soviet source with access to the Manhattan Project. The codename, Charles. The Americans began narrowing down suspects. Someone who'd been at Los Alamos. Someone British. Someone with advanced theoretical knowledge. The circle kept tightening. British intelligence was mortified. They reviewed their personnel files, and one name kept appearing: Klaus Fuchs. Quiet, reliable, trusted Klaus Fuchs. In December 1949, MI5 officer William Scardon sat down with Fuchs for a routine interview. It was supposed to be a formality, just clearing up a few inconsistencies. Instead, Scardon found himself across from a man who seemed almost relieved to be questioned. Over several gentle, patient conversations, Scardon never threatened, never accused directly. He simply gave Fuchs space to talk. And Klaus Fuchs, burdened by years of secret guilt, perhaps tired of living a lie, began to crack. On January 24, 1950, Klaus Fuchs walked into a security office and confessed everything. He detailed his meetings with Soviet agents, described the documents he'd passed, acknowledged he'd been spying since 1941. The interrogators sat in stunned silence as this mild-mannered physicist calmly explained how he'd given Stalin the atomic bomb. When asked why he'd confessed, Fuchs gave an answer that still haunts intelligence agencies. "I had to. I couldn't live with myself any longer." The trial of Klaus Fuchs lasted barely 90 minutes. March 1950, London. The courtroom packed with journalists. Fuchs pleaded guilty to 4 counts of violating the Official Secrets Act. His lawyer barely spoke. There was no defense to mount. Fuchs had confessed everything, in detail, willingly. The Lord Chief Justice addressed him directly. "You have betrayed the hospitality and protection given to you. You took advantage of our trust to betray the nation that saved you." Fuchs stood silent, expressionless behind those thick glasses. The maximum sentence was 14 years. In America, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, convicted on far less evidence, would be executed for atomic espionage. But Britain didn't have the death penalty for peacetime espionage. Fuchs was sentenced to 14 years and led away quietly. But the damage was already done. The Americans were apoplectic. They'd trusted Britain with their most vital secrets, and a British scientist had handed everything to Stalin. Security cooperation froze. Relationships between Allied intelligence services cracked. The special relationship between America and Britain suddenly didn't feel so special. And across the Atlantic, in a nondescript building in Virginia, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover asked the question that would launch the most intense spy hunt in American history. If Fuchs was passing information to the Soviets, who was his American contact? That investigation would lead to Harry Gold, then David Greenglass, and ultimately to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Klaus Fuchs hadn't just given Stalin the bomb. He'd detonated an entirely different kind of explosion, an absolute collapse of trust. That would define Cold War paranoia for decades. Let's be clear about what Klaus Fuchs actually accomplished. When the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb in August 1949, American and British intelligence agencies had estimated the Soviet Union wouldn't achieve nuclear capability until the mid-1950s at the earliest. The Soviets beat that estimate by at least 4 years, possibly more. After Fuchs confessed, Soviet scientists later acknowledged that his intelligence accelerated their program by years.
They didn't have to make the same mistakes, didn't have to test dozens of failed designs, didn't have to solve problems American scientists had already cracked. Fuchs had given them the answer key. The immediate result was the nuclear arms race. America couldn't maintain a monopoly on atomic weapons, so it pivoted to building more, bigger, and more destructive bombs. The hydrogen bomb, ICBMs, a nuclear arsenal that could destroy the world several times over.
The Soviets matched them bomb for bomb. Mutually assured destruction wasn't an inevitable evolution. It was accelerated by one man's decision that the world needed to be balanced. Klaus Fuchs wanted to prevent catastrophe by equalizing power. Instead, he created the conditions for potential apocalypse. Think about every Cold War crisis that brought humanity to the brink. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the nuclear close calls, the doomsday clock ticking closer to midnight year after year. All of it happened in a world where both superpowers had nuclear weapons, a world Klaus Fuchs helped create.
Klaus Fuchs served 9 years of his 14-year sentence. Good behavior got him released early in 1959. The British government stripped him of his citizenship and deported him immediately. He flew to East Germany, the communist state he'd always believed in, and was welcomed as a hero. He was given a prestigious position at the Central Institute for Nuclear Physics in Dresden. He lived a comfortable life, respected and honored by the East German government. He married. He settled into quiet academic work. And he never, ever expressed regret for what he'd done. In interviews, Fuchs remained calm and certain. He acknowledged he'd broken British law, but insisted he'd acted according to his conscience. To the end of his life, he believed he'd done the right thing, that giving the Soviets the atomic bomb had prevented nuclear war, not enabled it. Klaus Fuchs died in 1988, just months before the Berlin Wall fell. He never lived to see the Soviet Union collapse, never saw the archives opened, revealing the extent of Soviet espionage, never witnessed the full consequences of the world he'd helped create. His obituaries in the West called him a traitor. In the East, they called him a man of principle who'd stood against Western imperialism. Both were right. Both were incomplete. Here's the haunting question Klaus Fuchs leaves us with. Was he wrong? Not legally. He absolutely committed espionage and betrayed the countries that protected him. But morally? Strategically? That's where it gets complicated. Fuchs believed American nuclear monopoly was dangerous, that one nation holding such devastating power would inevitably use it to dominate others. He thought sharing atomic secrets would create balance, and balance would prevent war. In a twisted way, he might have been partially right. The Cold War stayed cold partly because both sides had nuclear weapons. Mutually assured destruction was horrifying, but it worked. We didn't blow ourselves up. But at what cost? Decades of living under the threat of annihilation. Proxy wars that killed millions. A permanent state of terror that defined generations. Nuclear proliferation spreading beyond the superpowers to Pakistan, India, North Korea, Israel.
Fuchs thought he was creating balance. He actually created a cage we still can't escape. And here's the really unsettling part. There are probably more people like Klaus Fuchs working today. Scientists with security clearance and strong beliefs about how power should be distributed. People who think they're serving a higher purpose by leaking secrets. Every intelligence agency in the world knows this. They screen for ideology, monitor for warning signs, build elaborate systems to catch insider threats. But Fuchs proved that the most dangerous spy isn't the one motivated by money or coercion. It's the one motivated by conviction, because convictions don't show up on security checks. On August 29, 1949, when the first Soviet atomic bomb detonated, Klaus Fuchs was in his office, working quietly on reactor designs. He knew what happened before intelligence did. He'd seen the calculations, recognized his own work in the Soviet achievement. Pride, fear, vindication, we'll never know his thoughts in that moment, but we do know what went through history. The nuclear genie was out, and Fuchs had opened it. Soviet scientists were brilliant, but Fuchs gave them years of stolen time. He was one man who believed his moral judgment should override nations and democratic governments. One refugee who confused loyalty to an ideology with loyalty to humanity. In the end, he didn't prevent catastrophe. He just made it mutually assured.
If you're watching this and thinking about the secrets being kept right now, the technologies being developed behind classified doors, the decisions being made about weapons we can barely imagine, remember Klaus Fuchs. Remember that the people with access to world-changing knowledge are just people, with beliefs, with traumas, with the capacity to decide that their judgment matters more than the laws they've sworn to uphold. The physicist who gave Stalin the bomb wasn't a monster. He was a believer. And sometimes, believers are the most dangerous people of all. If this story left you questioning everything you thought you knew about the Cold War, make sure you subscribe because we're diving deep into the shadows of history where one person's decision changed everything. Hit that like button if this story got under your skin, and let us know in the comments. Was Klaus Fuchs a traitor, or did he actually prevent World War III? The truth, like most things in history, is probably more terrifying than we want to admit.